I'll start off by saying that names are incredibly important. Names are so important. Recently, actually, my husband and I were at the Walpole Scholarship Foundation's fundraiser, and I know some of y'all were there. I see some head nods. And we were really into it. It was a trivia night, and one of the final Jeopardy questions stumped me, and I haven't stopped thinking about it, and shucksy, not getting it. And it was about the importance of names. And the question was this. Let's see if anybody here gets it. There's this one name that has always been vaguely popular for girls in America, and right up there in like maybe the top 30 or 40 names for the last few decades, really. But in 2015, that name dropped in popularity like a rock, and nobody named their daughter this name after 2015 anymore. And the question was, what is that name? And we couldn't get it. Anybody have a guess? If you do, shout. Nope. Alexa. The name was Alexa. Nobody wanted to get their daughter confused with Alexa. Good job. Yeah. So names are important, and baby names reveal a lot about society. I'm still kicking myself I didn't get that one. What we hope and what we dream, we put that into our kids' names. Now, long ago, people used to name their kids all kinds of things, especially here in New England. Our Puritan ancestors would name their kids things like temperance and prudence and constance. And over the years, one of the most constant names that folks, whether they were oldie-fashionedy or now times, people have named their kids names after the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mary, Sarah, Hannah, Rebecca, all of those classic biblical names never, ever, ever go out of style. They never drop like a rock. But there is one name that has always sat at the bottom of the pile that nobody has ever named their kid. And if they did, I'm not so sure about what kind of parents they are. That's the one biblical name of Job. Nobody names their kid Job. Even though Job is one of the most faithful characters in the Bible, he is lifted up as someone who perseveres and just has enormous amounts of faith. Why wouldn't you want to celebrate that? Nobody names their kid Job, because nobody wants to risk cursing their child with a name like Job. Because Job's life was, without a doubt, one of the most awful and misfortunate lives that you've ever found in Scripture. But there's another reason, too, and that's found in the meaning of Job's name. See, Job itself, in Hebrew, means persecuted or hated. That's a doozy. So we'll be spending the next 4 weeks, or starting today, 3 more weeks, going through this book of Job, this book of somebody who was named persecuted and hated, and seeing what it has to teach us. Now, why would we go and do something like that? Isn't Job depressing? Well, yeah, it is depressing. But it's important to read the book of Job every now and then. And it's important to read it together in community or at some point in your life, because you may have a reason at some point in some time in your life where you yourself feel like Job. Or maybe you know somebody in your life who is going through a Job-like experience. And I think given the year that we have, or year and a half that we have had, many of us suffering through that pandemic, but then layered on top of it all manner of personal crises, many of us have found themselves relating to Job this year. And folks have been wondering, why do some people have all the hardship? Why do the worst things sometimes happen to the absolute best people? How can this be? You pick up the phone, you hear that so-and-so had just another death in the family, and you wonder, how could that be? Now, scholars believe that Job is actually a theological allegory, and it's a theological counterpoint to the theology that precedes it in the Bible, the Deuteronomy Code or the Deuteronomic Code. Now, one of the neat things about the Bible, some people read the Bible like it's all saying the same thing, but when you really read the Bible, you realize that it's dialogue and it's conversation. And it's people who have been connected to God and loved God with all their hearts, minds, and strengths, who are wrestling with big questions. And so people see the book of Job as a counterpoint dialogue to a lot of the theology from earlier in the Old Testament. Theology that would say things like, if you are doing good in this world, then blessings will come your way. And the opposite, which folks don't always want to face when they believe that, if bad things happen to you in this world, well, maybe it's your fault. Maybe you are not living as righteously as you should have. See, on the surface, believing that blessings are always associated with good just sounds good. We love that idea, but when you take that logic a step further, it can be damaging. I just finished watching the HBO series about a cult. Folks who have been coming to United Church and seen me preach know I love cults. I'm obsessed with cult documentaries. Can't get enough of them. So if you're also, and y'all have told me, because I've talked about this in the past, that some of y'all like cults too, check out the new HBO documentary series on this latest cult, a group out of Tennessee called the Remnant Church, Christian cult led by a charismatic weight loss pastor. Can you believe it? Yes, that thing exists. I had never heard of it, but she's a charismatic weight loss evangelist and leading a church that became more and more and more and more cult-like over the years. Now, one of the most heartbreaking parts of that documentary is when they talked about how everybody in that church wanted to look good. It was really important to show you were thin and beautiful, kind of a Stepford Wives kind of look, because that meant, in their view, that you were blessed by God, that you were righteous. If you had all the good looks, all the money, all the wealth, you were righteous. And they had no room in that church for something tragic happening. They had no room in their theology of that church for something bad happening. And so when that charismatic weight loss pastor lady's daughter lost a baby at 5 months old, that church said nothing. They said nothing. And what they did, even worse, they started interviewing all the couples and the other families in the church, interrogating them to see had they misstepped, because somebody must be to blame for that baby's death. That's the dangerous theology that a lot of folks get trapped in when they get too locked into that Deuteronomic theology that blessings mean good things and bad things mean something's awry. And Job comes in as a counterpoint to that. Now, that extreme example of the remnant church is easy for us to discount. We're not like that. We don't believe that way. That would never be us. But just this week, the U.S. passed 700,000 coronavirus deaths. 700,000 coronavirus deaths. And while many of us acknowledge what a tragedy that truly is, it's now the deadliest pandemic in U.S. history. We have far surpassed the flu of 1912, I believe it was. 1918, when was it? That one? You know what I'm talking about, that one. We far surpassed it, deadliest in U.S. history. While many of us acknowledge what a tragedy that is, our human minds are always grasping at reasons to justify the misfortune of those who have died. And I've heard it, good-hearted people telling me, oh, I'm so sorry that my friend died, but you know what, they were old, or they had poor health, or they had pre-existing conditions. And that all might be true. Heck, it probably is true. But it doesn't take away from the sting of those 700,000 deaths. It's not a justifying reason for that person who otherwise would have been alive to be dead. But our minds, our human minds, we want to make an excuse. We want to be able to say that bad things won't happen to us because we are somehow set apart. It has to be something bad that someone else was doing, like being old or having a pre-existing condition that will keep danger from our doorstep. We're fearful of what the world might be if things aren't so neatly packaged in that Deuteronomic code. And it's because God knows that our minds work this way that I believe that God gave us the book of Job, that we have that counterpoint in our Bible. And it's meant to be the counterpoint to that kind of bad theology, that theology that condemns those who are suffering, makes excuses for it, why they deserve it. And it begins, as we heard, as Mike read for us, like a bizarre and twisted fairy tale. There once was a man named Job. There once was a man named persecuted, hated, and he lived in the land of Uz. And he was blameless and upright, and he feared God and turned away from evil. And from there, it quickly becomes clear that this isn't going to be a story about anything at all that Job has control over. Because as soon as we learn about Job's perfection, this story quickly turns to the main actors in this story who aren't Job at all, but God and Satan. Now, a lot of people point out that it might seem unfair of God to ruin Job's entire life, and spoiler alert, kill off his whole family and all his animals just to test his faith. I know if I was one of Job's children killed off, I wouldn't be so happy to know that the reason for my death was to test my father's faith. That doesn't seem mighty fair to me. But I think that focusing on that situation, because that is unfair, right? A little bit misses the point of this book. Now, Job is not a history book in the Bible. The Bible has all different kinds of genres: poetry, history, theology, songs. Job is not a history book. It's not meant to be read as an exact description of how God works. Job is more like a theological fairy tale. It's meant to be more like one of Jesus's parables. Again, there once was this man named Persecuted, and he was perfect in the eyes of God. And in this fairy tale, there is another important name. And that name reveals what kind of story we are going to tell here. And the name is Satan. Now, we think we know Satan, but the Hebrew meaning of the word Satan, which in Hebrew is Hasatan, it means literally the prosecutor. The prosecutor. So we have the prosecutor, and we have the persecuted, and we have God. Now, scholars think that this is basically the setup for an elaborate trial. And we should think about this as sort of a trial story. But as we continue to try to imagine what ultimately Job is all about, it's important to keep in mind that Job is not the one actually on trial here. Though he is being tested, what is actually on trial is that bad theology, or not bad if incomplete theology of the earlier books in the Bible. And the book of Job is going to nuance it and sometimes even flip it on its head. It's going to show us what suffering really is, why it might happen, and what it might mean or might not mean. Now, we're going to pick up this story again next week. This is one of those series where it's going to build on each other, and we're not going to get the final payoff of what Job is going to teach us until we see the end of his story. But I don't want to leave you here entirely without hope today. I don't want to drop you right there trying to understand where this story might be going. So before we move on with our worship today, I'm going to leave you with some good news. No matter how much Satan has been walking to and fro across this earth, and these days Satan does seem to be getting around quite a bit, there is one person who is not aimlessly stirring up trouble, but rather standing right by your side as you make your own journey through life, always there when you need him. And that person for Job and for you is God. I want Jesus to walk with me.
I want Jesus to walk with me.
All along my pilgrim journey, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me. In my trials, Lord, walk with me. In my trials,